O lamentable creature, once revered, now hunted, caught, and released, and again for sport. Fatigue and defeat, each time stripped of a limb your captors eat. You with the face of the future, legs of the past, and soul of the present. You in stasis in decay, sullied by hands at midnight. You who cannot die, but in our sordid hearts deny wisdom for knowledge.
I feel like there were a lot of references there, perhaps to the Organism of the Week, and of course to today's topic, which is on time, embodiment of the past, present, and future.
Yeah, I don't know what we're going to call this episode. It's just kind of an idea I had because I've been thinking of a few disparate things, each relating to one's society's depiction of the past, depiction of the future, and also how that relates to the way that we experience the present. And of course, this is kind of relevant to this podcast specifically because our whole thing, our whole gimmick, if you want to be cynical, is that we are trying to paint a picture of a utopian future. And I was like, is this even a good thing to do? Is there historical precedent for this being useful? Is there historical precedent of this on a large scale? And also, I think I mentioned in last week's episode, I was reading a book by Jules Verne called Paris in the 20th Century, which was ostensibly pretty dystopian, but moreover than any kind of cynicism or like negativity it might have imparted on me, I was just impressed by how accurate the predictions were 100 years out. So I was like, that's really fascinating. So we have a few different topics that we're going to try and squeeze, I guess, into one
semi-coherent conversation.
Sure. And we're starting where else? Ancient Greece.
At the Oracle in Delphi. I don't know how you refer to the Oracle. It's a person, but I feel like it's also a phenomena, a place.
An institution.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, despite being like 22 and having more than a passing knowledge in Greek mythology, especially from a literary sense, I honestly did not know much about the Oracle before we decided to chat about it on this episode. So doing some research on that was fun. Just to relay the mythology of it, the story of it for people who maybe don't know, the Oracle of Delphi. Delphi was a place. The Oracle was a person who lived inside this place where people came from all around ancient Greece to receive prophecies about the future, to ask questions and receive answers. And the mythological story about the location of this place was that Zeus, the king of the gods of Olympus, released two eagles in different directions because he wanted to see where they'd collide so that he could see where is the center of the universe. And even when I read that really inspired me for some reason. I think it's this vision of divine beings having such a curiosity as that.
Yeah, having questions that need answers.
So in this spot, which was at Delphi, I think it was the foot of Mount Parnassus in ancient Greece, they built what is the temple of Apollo, who was Zeus's son. And Apollo, among other things, was the god of truth and prophecy. So fitting. And the oracle, who in this place was called the Pythia, which was kind of a role or title handed down, I think for centuries this place was in operation, was a priestess who would enter a kind of shamanic state when people came and spoke to her and asked her questions. I found conflicting reports on this, as you'd imagine, because it's like over 2,000 years ago. But the way I envision it is that they asked her questions and there was some report that she like inhaled some air that was coming through the vents.
Yeah, there's like ethylene in it. Is that the right compound?
Yeah.
Yeah, but how I imagine it is more her in a kind of self-hypnosis state of prophecy. It only happened once a month, right? Like the 7th of the month, because that was Apollo's birthday.
So she's communicating with the gods, with the fates, and then she relays the information. And again, there's conflicting reports whether she relayed it directly to the askers of the questions or whether there was a team of priests there to translate her incoherent, prophetic bambling. But that's what it is, and we wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, I was happy to learn about this because all I knew of oracles was the idea that is in kind of the New Age spirituality of like oracle decks of cards, which all have different meanings. Sometimes they're just images, sometimes they're words, sometimes a combo thereof. And I was like, oh, an oracle, it's like a deck which you refer to for advice in New Age spirituality. And I suppose I knew an oracle was like used to be a person, but I didn't realize that there was this one specific place where there was the most famous oracle, which I was fascinated to learn about because it's such a phenomena. It seems like it stretched across countries, across borders, in ways that things didn't used to. Like, things used to be pretty...
You mean it was famous?
It was famous. Yeah.
And what another thing I found funny about it is that it has this kind of the self-centered nature where they're saying, oh, the center of the universe, that's right here.
Yeah.
We would never say that today because, well, for one, we know astronomically that this is not the center of the universe, not even close.
Yes.
And for another, I feel like we're just much more reluctant to take that kind of extreme pride in that in our place. Maybe for the better, but
yeah,
that's something that's always impressed me about the Greeks.
Yeah, and this temple famously had 3 inscriptions upon the doorway. And then, of course, there were these other inscriptions throughout the building, all things the Pythia had said or universal truths.
The attribution of the maxims, they're called, the Delphic Maxims. Again, there's, I think, a lot of dispute about that.
Of course.
But I think the explanation that I like the most, that seems the most believable to me, is that they were just popular slogans.
Yes.
That they kind of inscribed there and that were perhaps later attributed to either the Oracle or to other philosophers of the day.
Yeah, the Oracle was also famous for giving really ambiguous answers to questions. So I feel like these are answers that maybe she referred to. Someone said, oh, what am I supposed to do about my daughter wanting to marry this man? And then she'd just say, know thyself. And then he'd be like, ah, yes.
It's so funny. She's like, she pulls her collar and she's like, know thyself? So yes, know thyself. That was the first of the inscriptions above the entrance to the temple. I love that idea of course it was in Latin, it didn't literally say know thyself. I love that idea of maxims being carved into stone in buildings that everyone has to pass through. I guess the only real version of that we have today that comes to mind is that a few days ago we were walking around and there was a school and there were 2 doors on the one side facing us and one said boys and one said girls. But there's nothing that's prescriptive. Act like this. That's really great. Maybe some churches.
Yeah.
So know thyself is the first one, and I would say the most famous. And this quote is associated with Socrates and Plato. They both spoke and wrote about it, respectively, a lot. What do you think it means? I
interpreted it 3 ways. And one way is know thyself as in kind of stay in your lane. It's like there was a oral history about a story of Prometheus, and then someone said to him, know thyself. And it just meant because he was trying to do something that he knew was not right or he knew would upset the gods, and they said, know thyself. And it meant stay humble, basically.
That's the main reading that I take of it. In conjunction with the other 2 maxims above the door, I think that all 3 of them were basically different ways of saying that people should humble themselves before they try and consult the realm of the gods. Know your place, effectively.
Yeah. To me, that wasn't the first interpretation I had of that.
No, I had the other reading, which was learn about yourself, especially self-understanding before you seek prophecy.
Yeah.
And Socrates was a big advocate for this. He basically just kept writing that it's ridiculous that there's all these people who seek knowledge about things as broad as politics or science or math or literature before understanding themselves. They've got it the wrong way around. And I think that's relevant to this discussion about our preoccupation in the modern world with the future as well as the past without really consulting who we are in the present.
Yes. As we'll get to later when we talk about the evolution of our relationship to the past and the future, is that there's a lot of different ways of thinking about it that I didn't realize because I've just grown up having one relationship to the past and the future. And one of them that I kind of resonate with and will probably talk about when we're talking about this relationship in the Solacene is the looking within instead of looking to a priestess or looking to a priest for the guidance of what the future holds or how we should relate to our ancestors. You have to look within. It'll make more sense later, I promise.
Well, I think in a lot of ways it is one and the same.
Yes.
Anything else on Know Thyself?
I was listening to a podcast and it was called The Future of Hope, is the series.
Nice.
And Know Thyself resonated with me because it was these 4 different people, all experts in random stuff, talking about how they see the future of hope. So it's like, what does that even mean? I don't know. Just the future of how we hope, I suppose.
Yeah.
And my idea for the future of hope is a generation who like seeks enlightenment. And I recommend listening to this podcast series because it's really interesting, and I feel like it really relates to this maxim, because all the people were saying, okay, how we used to hope was kind of just like recklessly. We were like, oh, the future's going to be great, like the 50s kind of vision of the future, all jet planes and everything. And they said, we really can't do that. That's not responsible. So we need to find ways of knowing ourselves in order to envision the future.
That's utopianism is what they were kind of referring to, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is especially an interesting discussion on this podcast.
Yes.
As we have a utopian podcast. The second Delphic maxim was nothing in excess, or moderation, which is probably the most famous Greek virtue, especially associated with Aristotle and his doctrine of the mean, because the most famous Greek vice, I suppose, that tended to plague all their epic heroes was hubris, which is typically an excess of pride, excess of the self, I guess you would say. So I was questioning whether we can discuss this in relation to future, past. Can there be moderation in dwelling in the future, moderation in considering the past? Is that a thing?
I think there has to be. In Taoism, there's this like falsely attributed quote to the Tao Te Ching, and it says something along the lines of, fear and hope are equally evil, like is the essence of it.
Ooh.
And I think what that is saying is we need moderation in our hope, but also in our stresses about the future. And if you want to reference what it was actually written, it's in verse 13, and it's talking mainly about fear and fame and infamy, I suppose. What do you think of that?
Fear and hope being equally evil.
Yeah.
I think it's very fascinating, because we often hear hope portrayed as a very positive thing.
Yes.
And I understand that it can have a lot of positive ramifications. Fear can even have some positive ramifications.
Yeah.
But to me, it just speaks about stoicism and taking things as they are, especially in the present, because I feel like we hear quite often think pieces, classes, tweets about how living in the present is a dying art, and we need to save people's experience of the present through mindfulness and meditation and techniques which really shouldn't be necessary and never were in the past, but today they are. But I never hear that our relationship with the future is similarly broken, and the past is similarly broken, and that's, it's like scales. It's like the present's messed up because of this kind of thing.
Yeah, and the way that our brains work is basically that we can only make predictions on the future. We can only process our surroundings based on things we've seen before. That's why we see faces in the clouds and imagine something in your peripheral that isn't actually there. But it's like we can only make our stresses or our hopes based on what we've experienced. It's very hard for us to do so in a mediated light, because it's always kind of these extremes that we've experienced before that are informing our predictions for the future. Because it's like if you were in a car accident in your past, every time you get in a car, that's going to be what flashes through your head, not the 1,000 times you were safely in a vehicle. Right. If that makes sense.
So that's the evil of fear. What about the evil of hope?
On one of these podcast episodes, the author of Eat, Pray, Love, actually, she was talking about her life partner recently passed away from cancer. And she said all these people who were around her as she was dying was saying, oh, but there was this one time that this person recovered from cancer at the last minute. So, like, don't give up hope. But then that didn't allow them to, like, be there and, like, experience the moment of, like, hey, these are your last few moments with your loved one. And she was talking about how that can be an equally negative experience, because then these people are going to live in a bit of regret after their loved one does pass away, because they refused to be in the reality. They were like holding out this kind of unrealistic hope.
Yeah, I actually spent a rather morbid evening recently reading online stories of people dying and what their last words were to their families.
Yeah.
Have you ever done that, or like considered that? A really common refrain I found was, it is what it is, by people who accept it. And that sounds kind of like that, like a rural wisdom. It's like, oh, grandpa, he really knew what he was talking about. But it's also, I mean, it's true for one thing, but it's also, it's about focusing on the present, if you take the words really literally, is like, it is what it is right now. It's not, it isn't what it will be, and it isn't what it was. Like, it is what it is in this second. It's kind of inspiring. I'm sounding like a motivational speaker right now. Every second counts.
Yeah.
Which is very true.
Yeah.
The third maxim, which has some translational question marks, but surety brings ruin, is what I found. Or another version was a pledge, then calamity, which sounds more accurate because it's like grammatically weird in English. And I always think they must have done some rewriting to make these things catchy in English, as they were presumably in Latin.
Yeah.
And this one seems kind of straightforward. And Diogenes, the philosopher, he saw it as like, beware false certainty. And I think that's about right. It's try not to
get comfortable.
Yeah, try not to get comfortable, but also I was thinking just try not to put all your hopes on it being sunny tomorrow because it might rain. And if you only dress for the sun, it's going to get rainy. But from a more kind of ontological, metaphysical standpoint, it's kind of like, don't always trust mortal reasoning. When I read this, I thought, isn't this kind of an ironic thing to be carved at the door of an oracle who's going to be telling you what she thinks is sureties about the future and what I assume everyone there believes to be sureties about the future. And the way the Greeks saw fate was a really funny thing. There's a lot of stories about, I mean, even the most famous one with the oracle is Oedipus going there and her telling him something tragic and him not believing it and then actively trying to make it not happen. And then in a roundabout way, it happens. If anyone's ever seen That's So Raven, it's very Oedipal.
Yes.
In a way. I don't want to be known for that quote. But what do you think about surety brings ruin?
How I interpreted that maxim was that basically I'm reading this book called Garden City, and it was talking about the Pharisees in the Bible who were Jewish leaders, and they basically took the Torah, like the Bible's rules, which I think there's like 167. Like, this is an estimation. But then they went and for every single rule that was written in the Torah, they made like 100 rules so that they wouldn't accidentally break it. Okay. They were trying to be sure that they wouldn't break the rules of the Bible. Sounds like a good thing. But then when Jesus came around and he was kind of challenging these rules that the Pharisees had written, and it's like Jesus wasn't saying the Sabbath is a bad thing because he would do miracles on the Sabbath. He was saying you need to have an open mind. It's like nothing's static, things are dynamic, is basically what he was saying. And so surety brings ruin to me is when you're trying to make sure that the rules of your religion or the rules of your lifestyle, that there's no cracks in them, it will just bring about cracks, and it will bring about kind of a subpar experience on Earth. Because
we're mortal.
Yes.
So when you try and micromanage everything that isn't in your control, that's why they say Jesus take the wheel, right?
Yeah.
I think Jesus takes the wheel is like surety brings, like, this sounds silly, but this is what I think it is. Obviously they were using Greek gods, but just to use divinity, just to use like the general term of divinity, it's like surety brings ruin, so Jesus take the wheel.
Yeah.
That's kind of what it is, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, we need to allow things to evolve. And I feel like that's a good transition perhaps into our conversation about kind of the later phases of our relationship to the past and the future. Basically, when the oracles were around, people thought kind of in the way that Hesiod wrote that things were just getting worse and they're just going to keep getting worse.
Yeah, so you're referencing, we should just mention it for people who don't know or have forgotten, Hesiod's 5 Ages of Mankind, which started in the distant past with the first humans who lived in the Golden Age, and everything was perfect, kind of like the Garden of Eden. Everyone was virtuous, everything was prosperous. Slowly kind of faded into the Silver Age, then the Bronze Age. He predicted that things would just continue on this gradual ethical and material decline, I suppose.
Yeah, so they thought it was all downhill. Then, of course, there were a lot of people then and then the later years after that who just thought things were as they were, like the prehistoric period before we wrote a history. People didn't really realize that things used to be a lot worse, like materially, like that people didn't know how to farm. Like, people didn't really know the history. They just kind of knew what their grandparents told them and what they hoped for their kids. And that was a static kind of hope and history, like vision of the past and the future. They just thought it was all the same.
Mm.
Plato and Socrates started to kind of think things are a circle. So things are cyclical. There was bad things that happened. Now might be really good, or now there might be tragedy. But there'll also be prosperity or tragedy in the future. So even when Plato was writing The Republic, he thought, this is a utopia, but this utopia will fail. And even within the utopia, there will be these cycles of existence.
Yeah.
Fast forward to the Enlightenment, when things just started happening, basically, like people were like, oh, we have these ideas, we have the scientific method, we have reform in the church, we have reform in the government. This is progress. And then that's for the first time in human history that we thought things are getting better. Things are actually linear. Like we have this history that everyone kind of knows now.
Right.
Things obviously are getting better, and then they're going to keep going.
And we started to characterize some of the centuries before as the Dark Ages.
Yes.
Which is something like, for instance, Hesiod never did that.
Mm-hmm. The enlightened way of thinking is what I just thought everyone kind of had. But then I realized there's a modern way of thinking, which is, okay, things used to be garbage. Things are garbage. Things are going to stay garbage. And then I feel like everyone has their personal golden age they refer to. Maybe it's the 50s. Maybe it's...
nostalgia.
Yeah, nostalgia. But everyone has something super personal to them, which is their kind of golden age that they refer to as...
It's funny because it'll be like 13-year-olds now.
Yeah.
They'll be like, man, 2011.
Yeah.
Those were the days.
Yeah.
But I guess 13-year-olds were only 3 in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
I don't know either. But until now, I feel like when we refer to history, we refer to our ancestors, or we refer to the lineage of our religion or the lineage of our culture, we'd say we can't change that. Like, that is set in stone.
Yeah, we have to honor that.
We have to honor that. And I think there's this kind of revolution of thought that's happening now, which is a good thing, of that, yes, we need to honor the core theologies and the core virtues of our lineage, but we also are allowed to evolve them. Because that's kind of what, when I was referring to the example of the New Testament in the Bible, of Jesus said that, he was like, okay, we need to honor these histories, these rules that were spoken by God to Moses on the Mount Sinai, but we also have to kind of update them a little bit. And we're allowed to update the way things are experienced. And I read that during the pandemic, 50% of young people tried a new spiritual practice, which like blew my mind. I was like, this is such a new way of thinking of our relationship to the past and the future. It's like, it feels almost optimistic to me that people said, I'm going to take this opportunity to connect with my heritage, or connect with a different heritage perhaps.
Right.
And
I mean, did it specify which types of spiritual?
No.
Thinking? It struck me just the way you phrased that religion or spirituality might just be synonymous with the phrase, how we understand the past and the future. Like that's a large part of what religion and spirituality do, be it your individual future, the afterlife, we were discussing about that this morning, or a culture's future.
Mm-hmm.
Just an example of a modern spirituality that I wanted to mention was astrology, horoscopes. From, what is it, maybe 2015 or 2016, when that started to have this resurgence, I was like, what is going on? Like, this is crazy. And I'm not the first person to observe that it's kind of coincidental how its rise in popularity has corresponded with all the craziness of the last few years. Pandemic, Trump, climate change, a lot of fear, as you put it. And it struck me that not just through horoscopes, which tell you about how your next month is going to go, astrology and I guess your sign, which vaguely gives you a blueprint for your life. Astrology has this benefit of also being able to contextualize the past, because when someone does something erratic, you can say, oh, that's a Gemini.
Yeah. Oh, Mercury was in retrograde.
I don't know if Geminis are erratic. I actually know very, very little about this, and I'm kind of pleased to, but just the idea that it provides a narrative, and that's all that people want, and they don't especially care whether it comes from the moon, the stars, the church, or just genuine rolling of the dice. I was thinking about something like the Magic 8 Ball, or like the fortune cookies. Yeah. These seem like they're kind of like holdovers
Mm-hmm.
from a pre-rationalist time, but
Yeah.
we still keep them in just as little quirks of society.
Yes, exactly. We thought we could logic our way out of everything. We were like, in the Enlightenment, we were like, there's an answer to everything. But then now the things are getting so crazy, just like in society, the way that culture is kind of disappearing, but also we need to find a way to like maintain the creation and existence of culture. The people are looking to these kind of spiritual techniques
Yeah.
to even just find the language to express these experiences that we all have.
Yeah, that's one thing I found when I was reading about kind of science, the science of astrology and the popularity of it. A lot of people are just saying it genuinely just gives you a vocabulary that lets your brain explain what's going on with people and the future and the past.
Yeah.
And also a lot of studies show that people turn to astrology, as I'm sure they do for all sorts of spirituality, in terms of stress and tension and anxiety. So it makes sense. Another little quirk that I wanted to mention, because I was trying to think about if we had anything kind of similar to the Oracle in today's, say, North American industrialized, largely post-religion culture. And the one thing that occurred to me, it's not so much a place as it is a time or a day, was Groundhog Day.
Okay. I do like that.
It's like this uniquely irrational holdover tradition in our culture. It's just this one day of the calendar where I don't know if anyone puts any stock into it. I don't know if anyone genuinely believes it, but it's like, well, we still do it.
Yeah.
We don't really care about it, but we still do it every February 2nd. And for those who don't know, the tradition is that there is a groundhog and everyone kind of gathers around its little enclosure, burrow. I guess it's probably usually in a zoo, right?
Usually.
And if it sees its shadow, which means if it retreats back into its little hole or house, I've never actually watched it, then winter continues. And if it stays out, then we're going to have a short winter. Like it's going to be over soon. And there's a reason this is February 2nd. It's because it's the dullest time of the year. So we need anything to, 1, get outside, 2, get outside together, and 3, entertain ourselves with. So we start watching this groundhog scurry around. It's like, will he? Will he? Ooh, like that. Some facts about Groundhog Day. I don't know why I thought this required some
context,
some background. But I wanted to know how old this was and whether it ever really was.
People believed.
Yeah. I mean, there's also the Farmer's Almanac, but that does actually have some scientific basis, right?
Yes.
Farmer's Almanac is kind of released every year, and it's like it's predicting the winter for the year and the precipitation and things like that based on trends, based on signs that they can see. I don't know, but they are actually pretty accurate. Groundhog Day is not accurate. It's effectively just flipping a coin.
Yeah.
And also, it was a real revelation to me as a young person that it isn't just one groundhog. Every location that celebrates Groundhog Day has its own groundhog. You
just thought it was Shubenacadie Sam?
That was the name of our groundhog. Yeah. So I just
our
assumed it was everybody.
Groundhog.
It's funny when you say like that, right? Yeah, that was our province's groundhog, Shubenacadie Sam. If you're interested in some other famous groundhog names I found, the most infamous, of course, is Punxsutawney Phil, who was immortalized in the Bill Murray film Groundhog Day. But there's also Dunkirk Dave.
Oh my God.
General Beauregard Lee from Georgia. And Chuckles the Ninth from Connecticut. He's their 9th Chuckles. So a long storied lineage of groundhogs. And also, when it comes to groundhogs, that's not the organism of the week. It should have been. But I didn't realize that groundhog was just meant the same thing as woodchuck and marmot. Like that's all the same animal.
Yeah.
And some other names that it's had in the past are land beaver and whistle pig.
Nice.
But as to this long tradition of Groundhog Day, it emerged from the German-speaking areas of settler US, especially the Pennsylvania Dutch communities. They used to use badges. This was in the 1700s and 1800s. And another very similar tradition was on the Christian Candlemas celebration, when the clergy would hand out lit candles. People would kind of say, oh, if the candles were short, then the winter's going to be like this. If the candles were long, the winter's going to be like this. So I really do think it's like February is a dark time. Yeah. So we got to do something about it. But the Bill Murray movie, it kind of pokes fun at this like small town, very pageanty type of celebration. And everyone's like, overly enthusiastic about it, and there's like a song and dance routine, and it's like, this is ridiculous. The whole town's themed after it. But the more I think about celebrations like this, the more I'm really on the side of those people. It's like that kind of pageantry, you know what? If it wasn't there, there'd just be no pageantry.
Yeah.
We got to have parades for something. We might as well parade for the Groundhog.
Exactly. I feel like in the Solacene, there will be this return to traditions. And I don't mean like return to a tradition that existed. Because I don't think there's any time in human history that I'm like, if we just were like that, things would be good.
Yep.
Because they've proven themselves that wasn't good. But I think in the future, there'll be this mixture of Groundhog Days, this liberty to, like, there's a freedom of religion now. It's a human right. It's in the constitutions of Canada and the States, and I'm sure lots of other countries. But it's like, I feel like there isn't actually this, like, we've almost placed it upon ourselves as lack of freedom. We feel like we need to make everything a bit palatable because we have that tendency to be like, things need to be marketable. So like Christmas needs to be marketable, Groundhog Day needs to be marketable. We can't actually be acting like we believe in the groundhog.
Right. So
we need to
like
make
the secularization of Christmas, etc.
Yeah. And I feel like, I don't mean everyone needs to be the exact same holidays, but perhaps you create a new tradition on Thanksgiving or create a new day in your family or in your community where mid-February you all plant garlic or whatever, and it's garlic day, and you talk about the history of garlics and something. I don't know.
100%. I mean, almost all our holidays had some type of harvest related or meteorological related. It's like, this is halfway between the equinox and the solstice. Like, they just had a bunch of reasons like that, which our ancestors needed to help navigate the times.
Yeah.
And we don't need anymore because we have supermarkets.
Yeah.
So it can seem silly to still celebrate those, and also new ones, almost by definition, have a type of artifice to them, especially when not everyone buys into them, and especially as they have this profiteering undercurrent. I don't want to get too much into that though, because the organism of the week this week is not the groundhog, nor the whistle pig. It is in fact the dreadnought.
The dreadnought.
Yeah, the Dreadnoughtus srani. That's the Latin name. I know you can see it on my page, so I'm just going to ask.
Is it a dinosaur?
It is a dinosaur, or it was a dinosaur. I'll just ask you to describe it. My little sketch.
Oh, Aaron. Were they striped?
No.
That was your interpretation.
Well, here's the thing. I don't think scientists know.
It's true.
I mean, it's like scientists don't even know if they had feathers, so
yeah.
Who are they to tell me it wasn't striped?
I'm going to call it a striped, very long-necked, giraffe-like creature.
Yes.
With a long tail. A hat. It's eating a plant. Very tall.
Right.
Small legs. Belly.
I just added the belly in because of its weight. But yeah, the dreadnought, in case you couldn't tell by the name, was an example of a titanosaur, which basically just means a really big dinosaur. They have found partial skeletons of 2 different specimens, and they estimate that this beast weighed over 49,000 kilograms. Wow. Yeah. And it was 26 meters long. They estimate it to have the biggest mass of any land animal. Land animal? I guess I wrote that. Every of any land animal ever. But I kind of like that typo.
Landimal.
Landimal. Dreadnoughtus means fear nothing. Yeah, because it was so big, even though it was a herbivore, so a gentle giant. It was around in the late Cretaceous period, probably around 70 to 76 million years ago. And do you want to guess why I chose this organism for this week?
The name, perhaps?
Fear nothing?
Fear nothing?
Actually, no, but I guess it makes sense. I just thought, well, we're talking about the past, so a really old organism would make sense. But also, there's this idea that a lot of people share that dinosaur fossils were at least part of inspiration for a lot of mythology, like dragons, etc. And that's something that from a kind of cynical perspective, you know, longing for the romance of the olden days, I could be like, oh, I wish we still had that kind of ignorance is bliss. But in my mind, the truth is actually just as exciting. Like that's just as wild as what they used to think that dragons were roaming around. It's like these were effectively dragons roaming around. Like this was 49,000 kilograms. We're not just guessing that. We used like 3D laser software to simulate the entire skeleton from a few bones that were found. It wasn't a few, it's like over 50%. But You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like since the Enlightenment and since like all of the scientific leaps, there's just like, well, why would we need to mythologize things? Why would we need to make up stories surrounding these things?
Yeah.
It's like we literally don't have to make up stories. We can use different stories from the past.
The truth is
exciting.
Stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about that in a kind of corny way when he talks about space, but
yeah.
he's like, well, and he'll say it in like a really dramatic way about how
yes.
all the particles in your body can be used for every element on Earth or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, another thing I wanted to mention about dinosaurs is that people always say, I don't know if this is outdated, but people say that kids go through a dinosaur phase.
Mm-hmm.
I remember I had dinosaur pajamas,
mm-hmm.
but I was not a kid. I was like 13, 14.
Well,
it's a
phase.
Adolescent.
Yeah.
But then I was like, well, good for them. And the real question is, why do we ever leave the dinosaur phase? There were just these legit giants used to roam the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And we're kind of like, oh yeah, no, dinosaurs, yeah, they existed.
Yeah.
But I should be shouting it right now
mm-hmm.
in excitement.
Yeah. I feel like we need to have wonder back in our lives.
Wonder is what I'm talking about.
Allow ourselves to be in awe. There's this other podcast I was listening to, and this man, John O'Donohue, he was a theologian, philosopher, psychologist, I think, and he was talking about like our relationship to time, and he said the Celts had a cool relationship to time, the way that we don't today, and a lot of other cultures kind of didn't have, and they saw that our moment right now is like a link between the past and the future.
Yeah.
Because right now we always think now is all we have. But it's like, no, right now it's your responsibility to relay how cool dinosaurs are to the future generation. If you don't do that, no one will. If you don't relay to future generations that, hey, on Christmas Eve we like open a present, future generations won't do that. And it's like, I don't think that we have to say everything. We don't have to say it all in a positive light. You can say, hey, there were these persecutions or these genocides that happened, both the good things and the bad things of the past to the future generations, or else they'll forget that the bad things happened.
And what's unique about our current time is that we can do that with more accuracy than anyone ever in history, because we know more about the past. And we know, like Hesiod could not have done that in an unbiased way because he just thought that everyone who came before him was better than him.
Yeah.
And we know more accurately the flaws and also the good things about our predecessors. I had this quote which was that science and technology revolutionize our lives, but memory, tradition, and myth frame our response. And again, it's just this idea of narrative and also cynicism and the information age in which we live right now. And I just think for the most part, modern life has kind of trivialized what used to be grand mysteries. Like the weather tomorrow used to be like, well, who knows? The sky's red. Shepherd's going to be happy.
Yeah.
But today we can check the weather, a couple of weeks from now, and it can be pretty accurate. And I think that's objectively better and more convenient, but we have to think about what we lost there, which is the idea of the unknown, and especially an unknown so great that people wouldn't even really consider it. Whereas today we might be fretting, oh, I hope my concert in 2 months won't get rained off.
Yeah.
Right? But they, for one thing, wouldn't even know that there was a concert going to happen in 2 months. So that kind of stressor wasn't in their mind. And for another, they'd be like, well, why am I going to worry about whether it's going to rain? I can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
But I think for us, the immediate access that we have to almost everything tricks our brains into thinking that we can affect it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about that this morning because I just always have anxiety, and I was like literally thinking about it, like thinking, okay, tomorrow I don't have anything for lunch. Like I haven't packed anything. It's like thinking about it. We think that we can prepare our minds for every single outcome and then nothing will surprise us. Kind of, is that the opposite of stoicism? Is that stoicism of just like, we think if we can think of every possible outcome, if we can think of the worst outcome, nothing will disappoint us?
Well, it's definitely not abiding by that maxim that surety brings ruin.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there was definitely just this embrace of spontaneity, I think, has slowly been eroded. And spontaneity used to be much of what defined life. But now it's like our days off are scheduled, our vacations are scheduled months ahead of time. And I'm not like faulting the people who do this because we do it too every weekend, every year in advance, basically. But it's just a darn shame that we have to do that. Because I like the idea of not having anything for the day ahead and then just on a whim saying, I'm going to go to Morocco today.
Yeah. how I framed it from my vision of the solar people. What do we call them?
The Solacenes.
The Solacene citizens.
Sure.
I framed it as this, that the relationships, Solicites, that they will pay respect to ancestors, thus choosing to remember the positives. Because when you pay respect to something, you're honoring the positive memory of it, usually.
Right.
But still critiquing them for the mistakes, just framed in a constructive way. So saying, our ancestors taught us this lesson, so that we don't have to experience it, and still framing it in a honoring way, because we don't want to, like, it's different for different people. Obviously, there's horrible people in history.
Right.
They can be framed in a different way.
Well, I think honoring is not maybe the right word, but I mean, you don't have to carve them into Mount Rushmore, but you have to, you can't burn the history books, let me put it like that.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to not burning the history books, something I've been thinking about is better education as to the good as well as the bad of history and culture, but not just writing off people as villainous and you know, equating them to like Darth Vader or something. Because the thing with Star Wars is that I don't know what Darth Vader stood for, right? So I don't know how to stop the next stormtroopers.
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about?
So if you're telling us about this horrible Canadian Prime Minister, you have to tell us what his platform was.
Yeah, you have to say why he was horrible.
The things he did.
And how he gained power.
Yes. But also, as you said, with the history in a positive way, it's like we only learn about a few positive things that happened in history. We don't learn about all of the things around the world that happened.
And barely any negative things, to be honest. I mean, I just think history is a ridiculous oversight of the modern North American, anyway, education curriculum.
Yeah.
And it's so localized. And I understand that, the connection with your town, but you should also be able to understand those world wars that happened like 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And a lot of graduates today can't. I think this is related to Hesiod, actually, because one thing I did like about his 5 Ages of Mankind is that because he considered things degrading not just by chance or by the will of the gods or materially, but fundamentally the way he characterized it was ethically we're getting worse. Like we're not moving in the right direction as a species ethically, and I am more morally flawed than my ancestors. What I like about that is it assumes the responsibility of the present, because it's kind of like, well, I'm flawed, I should be working to change it. And that's a great thing. But I feel like today one of the faults of the way we conceptualize the past and the present is that the people of the past were really bad, we're better than them. And whether it's true or not is kind of irrelevant. It's about whether it's a helpful way of viewing things. And I don't think it's especially helpful or productive. I had this other point just about the information age and cynicism, which is the sense of everything that happens, I know it's going to happen. Like with politics, people rolling their eyes at everything and saying, oh, how predictable. And I actually think part of the appeal of extremism and demagogues is that they're just unpredictable. You don't know what's going to happen. And for a lot of people, I think that's worth a lot because it's entertaining if nothing else.
Yeah, but I feel like it's like we know that our actions have consequences. Like as little as we know about history, we know that when we do things just kind of out of boredom or we do things out of desperation, usually the results aren't good. Like we need to be a bit more, we need to plan a little bit, but we need to, take responsibility, I guess just is the crux of that. And I guess that kind of relates to what we were saying earlier about the looking inwards for a relationship to the future and the past of like, what do I have to offer? What's that place in me that kind of hasn't been tapped yet?
Yeah. Continuing that theme and continuing the discussion of the Solicites, how the people of the proposed utopian future contextualize their past and their future. Yeah. I know it might sound kind of confusing to people. It's like in calculus when you do graphs of other graphs. Yeah. It's like 4-dimensional. I had this idea of, when people push that notion of self-love so that you can grow as an individual. I think it's like that, but just on a culture-wide scale. People say that if you want to grow, you have to accept and kind of integrate with your flaws. Yeah. And not just say, oh, I'm really bad, I hate myself, and because that just creates a cycle of self-loathing or whatever. That's, I think, a good way of characterizing where we're at as a culture right now. Yeah. And another quote I read recently, which is that it's like a bicycle. You'll go where your eyes go. And I think that might be true of society as well. Society goes where the eyes go. So as for thinking of the future, I think in general, I mean, just as a disclaimer, I think the Solacene people should think less of it. Like, not think of it as less, but spend less time considering the future, because I don't think that's always the most productive. And spend more time thinking about the small scale community or individual idea of who will I become, because that's, or who will my family become, or who will my town become, because that's a little bit more relevant. And that, like, the future is just made up of you in 10 years times 8 billion.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think there's a little bit, like, too much large scale thinking about the future of the species, from my observations, tends to lead in two directions, into nihilism or into utopianism, like us. And you kind of denounce at the start, neither of which are probably really healthy. Like, I don't think it would be great if everyone was burying their heads in the sand of the Solacene. But sometimes I think just a little once a week escape, I guess.
Yeah.
Not really escape, though. It's more of a blueprint.
I mean, we were talking about manifestation journals and, like, the power of writing, like, I am statements and putting pictures of, like, what you want your future to look like on pages. And when you get it down there, it's like you're not constantly opening it up every time you're, like, going to buy something or every time you're making a decision, like, to look at it. The act of putting it on paper was enough to inspire your consciousness to make positive decisions. And I feel like listening to this podcast or recording this podcast is enough. It's not like I'm listening to this all week saying, yeah, this is what the Solacene is going to look like. It's
and ignoring the pandemic,
Yeah.
climate change, etc.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess once a week was kind of a silly thing to say, but it's about the future having a proper place in your mind.
Yeah.
And the past having a proper place in your mind. And as I said, like a bicycle, society will hopefully go where we want it to go. Although I guess with Hesiod it didn't, because it actually did improve from him on. But my reasoning for that was that he still had something to live up to. It's just that his was far in the past rather than far in the future, as might be in utopians.
Yeah. I feel like the Solacene people, when they're thinking about the future, they're
You
either
mean the
thinking... Solacites.
Sorry for interrupting.
They will either think short-term future or long-term future. Right now we're stuck in this weird, like, we're either thinking about way after us and our whole entire lineage has, like, died off, basically. Or we're thinking, ooh, if I buy this stock, I'm going to be rich in a few months or a few weeks. And we don't think about the long-term investments in, like, okay, 2 generations down the road, if we pollute in this river, they're not going to have a fun place to go swimming. We just have, like, I feel like the places in the future that our focus is right now are off, and they need to be kind of readjusted to different places in the future.
Recalibration.
Yeah.
It's a very specific way of ending the episode, unless you had any other things that you wanted to close on.
Can I close on my statement on what the Solacite's future vision is?
Yeah, of course.
So my statement that I wrote is that all choices consider sustainability. We know now that life isn't static and our actions have consequences. As something they can manifest and build, but that can come to be in the now too. So that means basically, like, we want to have a vision for something that can be, but realize that our actions, like, can make it happen now on, like, a small scale. And finally, we have to be open to our role in shaping the future, not just deconstruct the past.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I like that.
Thank you.
That's what people say, right? It's like, if you want to change the world, think about what you're going to build for the future, not what you're going to take down from the past.
Yeah, you need to stand for something.
Not just against things. Lovely. If you want to consume, if you want to consume more Solacene content, check us out on TikTok and Instagram. It's all in the description. Also, the Solacene blog, also known as Aaron's Poetic Musings.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye.